this is the panel, and I think Beth is gonna. Is Beth around? Is going to wander around with. There you are, with a microphone. So it's an opportunity for any questions or anything we want to just chat about from what's been said already, or anything that's relevant to issues of leadership and equality of leadership and how we can grow as leaders. It's over to you, really. So who has a first question? I think there, and then.
Okay, what practical advice would you give for getting started in sort of speaking in Christian circles or Christian leadership in general? Would you say you need to be ordained, or would you give other advice about training for leadership and ministry?
How to get started.
Hello. I would say definitely don't need to be ordained. I guess it probably depends on what opportunities you have around you, but I would look for those. My experience is normally that guys like to offer themselves, and women often wait to be asked. But if you feel like a real desire to want to have a go, or at preaching or leading or whatever, or friends are saying to you, why don't you, but you're shying off, then I would say talk to your friends about it, get them to pray for you, and then offer, like ask your church leader, or if you're in a small group and there's an opportunity there to lead something, ask, can I lead next week? You'll probably freak out a few days later and think, I wish I never had, but then get your friends to pray for you again. But yeah, just find opportunities to have a go, and if you know, if you're feeling a bit nervous about it, then start in a context that feels a bit smaller and feels less scary, and then just keep having a go. You'll make mistakes, that's perfectly fine in natural, and get people to give you good feedback. Ask for feedback from people that you trust to be honest with you but also love you. And there may be some people that will give you feedback which needs filtering, and then you can ask your friends to help you filter. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
I would say find a context to serve in. So particularly if you're not sure, if you have a sense of I'm called to do something but I don't know where, I've always found it really good for me to serve somebody else's vision, because leadership is serving people, isn't it? So I'd ask where there was a need to get involved, and sometimes you find yourself doing things you don't want to do. But it's all part of the training. I'd say if you feel called to, in particular to speaking, you want to know the Bible really well. And so I would say every opportunity to get into the Bible and to learn it really well is really important. And I would say, depending on your age and stage in life, to consider whether there are classes or courses you can do that can help you dig deep into the Word, because it's precious and we want to communicate it well. The other thing I'd encourage us to do if we're thinking about leadership is in many ways process some of these things, because at some point it comes up about you being a woman in leading. So rather than it happen to you, it's helpful if you've begun to process it with people and read things for yourself.
Any other questions from over here? Cool.
Hello. I wanted to ask, I appreciate the need for women-only spaces, but does having an event about equality which doesn't allow men to be part of it somehow make women in leadership a women's issue and women's responsibility, when actually it's usually men that are preventing women from fully realising their leadership? Not all men, some men. And how do we ensure that men are being equipped to understand an egalitarian theology in the same way that women are?
That's a really great question, and definitely one that we've debated ourselves as we've come to put on the event is, is it right that we just gather the women together? And ultimately, we really recognise that this is definitely a male and female issue, and exactly what you've said, that actually in some ways, it's so often male leaders that are the blockages, to be frank. And so I think there's a couple of things. One thing is we felt we really wanted to, at least for now, do today. This day is not set in stone. It won't always look like this. Who knows what we'll do another time. But we felt we really wanted to specifically honour you, encourage you, cheer you on. And so the teaching today has been and will continue to be very much aimed at us as women. But there are other things that we want to do to make sure that the men are hearing the message as well. So partly the booklet that we produced that you've got is a way of making that teaching really accessible for all. We're committed at our summer festivals that we will always, at least for the foreseeable future, be saying this message very, very clearly. And in a funny way, we're actually more likely to pick up the guys that route anyway. Very few men, unless men realise that this is an issue that they need to grapple with, they don't realise that it's an issue that they need to grapple with, do you know what I mean? And so we've got to kind of get them where they are. And it's much more likely the festival, as I explained earlier, for those that aren't Soul Survivorites, that's what we do, and there's a seminar programme there. And it's more likely that one of them might wander into a seminar there than come away for a whole day. You're absolutely right. And I think part of our job at Soul Survivor is not just kind of what happens here, but there's conversations that we're having with other people, you know, because we're so passionate about this, and we're so there's a sense of righteous anger that where another message is out there sometimes. But I suppose really just for today, what today is about is specifically reaching into your questions and your call and cheering you on and encouraging you, but it's not the full story.
Great question. Anyone around the back? Cool.
Hi, I was just wondering, I mean, obviously men and women are different. Equal 100%, yes, with you on that. But what about a sense of men and women do have different roles, different kind of men are men and women are women? Yeah.
I would say that I often see those things very different in different cultures. When people often said men are like this and women are like this, I'd say, do you mean white women are like this and white men are like this? Do you mean black men are like this or black? Because it does vary. It does vary. There are things in certain cultures that would be deemed utterly unacceptable in this room, and others seem that people are like, what's that about? So I don't buy it that naturally, probably because I've lived in a multicultural context all my life, and they vary. They just do vary. And that doesn't ignore the fact that there are different physical attributes, and so there are different physical things, like, you know, guys aren't giving birth anytime soon, things like that, and therefore how that affects certain things is real. But when it comes to specific, men are like this, women are like this, I struggle with it because I don't see it across every culture, and I don't see it across every socio-economic group.
Cool. Anything else? Cool. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about your experiences of leading with small children. I'm often left feeling at church like I'm not being a good mum because I want to lead, and that I'm somehow letting down my children in a way that I don't think my husband would be made to feel by wanting to lead when he's got small children. So I wanted to ask about your experiences of that.
Great question.
Well, it's very pertinent for me because my second is just 10 weeks old, and do you know, partly I think I'm being a good mum if I model to my children following whatever God has got is calling me to, and so that models to Esther that I love her and that I love her so much that I make sure that she's with other people that love her today. Mike's had a very good cuddle, and in fact he said, you know, just give him your children and then you can get on with it. He's very good. He's very good. I said it's because this area of him is big enough to accommodate them. It's the next best thing to boobs. It's true, children are always comfy on you. Anyway, so I think that's the short answer. The long answer, which I won't give now, is that it's complicated. I mean, when I was getting ready to come out the house today, I was muttering under my breath, equal, whatever. There's me trying to, you know, wash her face here, put my own makeup on, pack the bag, make sure I've remembered to sterilise her dummies. And when my husband goes out to work, it's easier. It is easier, especially when you're breastfeeding. I mean, that is a whole other, that's where I was late. You probably worked that out for yourself, but there's some things other people can't help me with right now, you know. So it's complicated, but I think that we are the best, to go back to my first line, you are the best mother when you model to your children that you will pursue whatever God is calling you to pursue. And then the rest of it you have to work out, and that's the difficult bit.
And we've learned to be really practical about it. And because I assumed when I had the kids I would stop doing stuff, and there were lots of internal reasons for that, and I think always wondering, is it right? Are people going to think I'm a terrible mother? And all that kind of stuff. And I think my husband and I sat down and he said, basically, if this is right, and he said, and I think it is, we're going to have to work out how to do this. So it's not my problem. It's not even a problem. It's ours we consider ourselves a family on a mission. And so not even just our family, our immediate family. We have an extended family. We've built a network of extended relationships to make it work. So Chris is like, I will learn everything except how to do their hair. I can't do their hair. I don't get that. Says, I don't have a fro, do you know what I mean, and all that kind of stuff. We're a biracial family. But he's learned everything, and so we gave time specifically to make it work, and that rather than assume, it's a real narrow view that only the mum is the one who can give certain things to the kid anyway, and it's really enriched their relationship. So to that degree, we wouldn't change it. And when people have a problem with it, he says, it's not your decision, it was our decision. And he says, he said, tell them to talk to me if there's a deal, because I believe this is our call as a family. And we include the kids in that in terms of praying, so they'll pray for recall. And we go on a journey together, but we have seasons. And so there are some seasons where I'm involved, and there are other seasons where I'm not. And making sure that we have to check we call ourselves Team Saxton. We see how are Team Saxton doing, what's God calling us to do. And sometimes God's calling us to do something with Tia's friends, and sometimes God's calling us to do something with Zoe's friends, and sometimes we're supporting Daddy, and sometimes it's Mummy, and it just rotates. Because every part of our life is this mission where we want to see people come to know God. So if you can marry some of the practicalities to make it work as well, there will always be people who have an issue with it. But sometimes I just invite those people to help. They change their mind after a while. It's funny.
Great. Another question from over here. Cool. And we're going to get to you. Here we go.
I was just wondering how you lovingly deal with it when you come up against people who are against you in leadership, and that might be friends or other leaders.
I'm going to give that to you
Oh, sorry. When you come up against people who are against you being a leader, friends or leaders, like how you can deal with it in the most loving way.
Yeah.
Do you mean people that don't agree with women in leadership? Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because I was at a conference a few days ago and was next to a guy, and we were talking, and he was really interested in what I was doing ministry-wise and said, I'd love to stay in touch and learn a bit more. So I said, I'd love to share. And then he said, I should also tell you I'm a complementarian when it comes to women in leadership, or a soft one. I didn't know what the difference between a soft or a hard one was in terms of complementarianism. But anyway, he said, he said, I believe in raising women up in leadership, but in terms of eldership, it's male. And so I just thought, gosh, what a dichotomy. You're sitting here interested in what God's called me to do with others and the ministry that I'm involved in, and recognizing that God's in that. But at the same time, you're also saying, I don't really believe in you being in sort of leadership, ultimately. And so I just felt like God say, actually, when you get on and do it, what starts to happen is that space opens up for conversation. And as we sat there and talked, I just said to him, I really appreciate you being honest with me, because he said, have I insulted you? And I said, no, you haven't, because you've been honest with me and you want to have a conversation about this. And also you want to explore what God is doing ultimately in the body of Christ, and I'm part of that. So I just figure it's a journey. So for someone like that, I actually wasn't insulted, and it was great to just talk about it a bit more, and we'll stay in touch and stuff. I've had other people who are just really rude, and that's really hard, but I guess it's just asking for God to give you eyes to see this person and through the blind spots and the issues that they're currently, theologically, where they stand. I think it comes back to, I guess, what Joe and Mike have talked about already, that who are we ultimately going to take our definition from as women? Is it Scripture and who God says we are, or is it what a man or another woman would say? And I think it's difficult, but you have to just go, okay, I believe this is what God says about me, and that's how I choose to allow myself to be defined. And though you may not see me like that, I'm not going to then strip you or respond to you in a way that then would strip you of your true humanity, or be horrible to you in response. But I'm just going to choose to love you, and that's tough, but I think it's part of the journey.
Great. Okay. Any other questions around here? You got one? Oh, there's loads.
This is probably for Joe. You mentioned your husband was a minister. I don't know how involved you are in sort of leading with him in the church, but I'm, as a vicar's wife and feeling called to sort of leadership in some way myself, I was just wondering if you had any experience on how to balance the sort of dynamics of maybe leading as a couple or being seen as a helper and not in the sort of strong woman way.
Yeah, in different church contexts, we've done it differently. So there was, right now where we are in California, I'm not particularly involved because with doing other things and been writing, the kids have been the main priority in terms of our local context. There have been other churches where I've been more prominent. And there are times when people come up and say, you need to tell your husband this. And I'm really blunt and I say, I don't play games. You need to tell him yourself. And I said, because really I can't help you. I sometimes have one-liners on certain things. And I think with Chris and I, we work it out. We look and again, we say, okay, what's right for this season? We would never be comfortable in a place that wasn't comfortable with women in leadership. Because that's just us. And he would find it very difficult to be there. It's just not our way. But I'm happy. I don't mind. I don't have to lead in that environment. I don't feel the need to, really. We tend to we see all of our life as what we're called to do, and then we just work out what bit is best. So there are some contexts that have expected certain things of me, and if it's worked, we've done it. But if it hasn't, we don't. Now, but it often does depend on that. Each congregation has been very different on how they've approached us.
Okay, great.
Hi, thanks. Slightly related, but not completely, to an earlier question. And I feel like I'm really blessed and lucky to have been in churches that believe in women in leadership. But what I observe in those churches, and those are churches who've had women in leadership for a very long time, is that there is still a gendered bias. There's still, and I think there's a second shift. Like there's a second shift for women in the secular workplace, which means they can't go as far as men in the workplace. There's the same thing happening in the churches. And it's not just women who have their own children. And I just wonder, how can we start developing theology and praxis that starts challenging some of those gender stereotypes that are not about women in leadership, because we're all signed up to that, but some of our other beliefs about the role of men and women that are, I think, are still holding women back. How can we start to challenge some of those things?
I don't know if that makes sense. Can you give us, eke that out a little bit? Give us some examples.
For example, the majority of people who are doing kids' church are women, which means that they have less time. Kids work. So they have less time to preach or to lead the service. Now, personally, I don't think that teaching the kids is less important than teaching the adults. I think quite the reverse. But it's that gendered thing. So most of the tea and coffee is still being served by women. You know, when women are up the front leading, their own children are still wanting them to look after them because someone else isn't doing that. And so it's those things which are meaning that actually, although this church says, yeah, men and women can lead, most of the preachers are men, most of the leaders are men, most of the kids workers are women. How do we start overcoming some of those things?
That's a really good question. We're all like, that's really, yeah.
I mean, I think there are lots of answers, and I'm sure we'll all have a different one. One of the things that Chris and I do a lot with that is he made a real investment, particularly in the woman who's leading children's work, and he got her preaching from time to time as a way of almost shifting the balance. But and they were very explicit, saying, you know, we need children's ministry, we need guys. We need mothers and fathers. And we try and promote the extended family, because there are single members of our church family. There are older members of our church family, younger members. So in all that we seek to do, because Sunday is still the platform. Whatever's up there, you're saying stuff. You're saying stuff. So I think what we've tried to do in some of that publicly is to have a multi-generational worship team has helped, or some of the testimonies, or some of the preaching has been a range of people with a range of gifts, because I think that communicates something. And then the other thing is that which we're also doing, because we're kind of on catch-up, really, in like you said, with the second shift, is we have to be really intentional about how we train women. And so whilst I'm up for mixed gatherings, I actually do think there's still a place for the single-sex one in this time. It may not be useful in 20 years' time, but right now, because of the confidence issues, because of the theological things, I think there's a relevance where we need to flex this muscle. And so some of it is what are we promoting on the Sunday, and what are our assumptions? So do I need to put a coffee pot in a guy's hand and say, could you just do a coffee, and then walk off before they have a chance to disagree? And I do that with anybody, to be fair. That's not a gender thing. That's just, let's all get involved here. What's the language we're using? Because if we're using the language of family, then it becomes inclusive. And then what are we doing privately to equip and invest in things? And I think if we know that people don't put themselves forward, it's made us realise we need to be proactive in saying, have you ever considered speaking? Have you ever considered, and they may not be a speaker at all, but it begins to start saying, you're looking. And saying, so what do you think God's doing with you? I think the onus becomes on us to do, not just from a public level, but from a private and personal one. Those are some of the things we're working on and stuff at the minute.
Oh no, I think the only just like literally a sentence is that we should be as well encouraged and look for those things that give us hope, because every now and again I think, oh my gosh, nothing's changing, and yet of course if I look back to my parents and how they led their church and all that, loads has changed, and it is, the church is a big ship, and so when it shifts it takes a long time, and probably because as much as possible I try to be a glass half full person. It's like I want to find things that encourage me that things are changing. Not that I would then go, oh, it doesn't matter, but more like, actually, we have moved on in the last X years. Let's keep praying and hoping and being proactive for change. Yeah.
Was there one right at the front?
More questions.
I was just wanting to know if you were in a situation where you felt that God had called you to a ministry in your church, and you kind of started that up and you saw it thrive, but there was an issue and you felt challenged that you knew that the people in your church didn't agree with women in leadership, how you'd kind of move on from, you knew you were called to be there and you were seeing things happen, but you then potentially couldn't go any further because they wouldn't allow it.
I think if you feel God's really calling you to be in a place, then it's then asking God, how do I remain in this place, do what you've called me to do here with others, and bless it, and pray for those that might be trying to squash you in terms of flourishing even more. And I think that's the really key thing. Like, if God isn't calling you to stay or remain, then you've got that freedom to go elsewhere where you would have more freedom to grow and stuff. So if he is calling you to stay, then I think then it is about being really prayerful about how to continue to be there and to grow the ministry that you're involved in with others, but then also how to speak to those that maybe have these blind spots. And I think that becomes then praying, because it's a spiritual issue, and then hearing God really clearly about how to address it in conversations, and maybe inviting them into situations where you and others are, whatever ministry you're involved in, to say, come and see what God's doing here, and kind of, I guess, maybe help them to see how God is using you and others, or working through you, not in a bigging yourself up way, you know what I mean, but like just so that they get to see what God's doing. And I guess if over a bit of time nothing's shifting, I guess you go back to God again and say, do you still want me to stay here? And for some people, I've known women who've been in those kind of situations for a decade, and it's only because God called them to be there and they were faithful and obedient to that, and God supported them to do that they did it, and they did it well. But I think if they hadn't been called to be there, I think they'd have really struggled.
I agree. It's brilliant. It's brilliant.
My question is about women as pastors. And I know that culturally in church, we're happy with women as pastors. But where do we stand with women as lead pastors? If a woman feels called to pastor, but her husband is a Christian man, but called to the workplace to serve God out in the marketplace. How does that work? Because it seems that there's still a lot of barriers in the way with a woman being the top leadership, I guess. It's kind of on the back of the question of the lady before, really. And I just wondered biblically how we stand on that.
I think biblically, I think two good examples are Deborah and Priscilla. And in terms of Deborah was a spiritual and a religious leader of the country and was married, and Priscilla was the more prominent in ministry. So I think we do have biblical precedent for it in the Old and the New Testament. I think culturally, I think ironically, sometimes what people say is a theological issue is actually a cultural one. I do know women who are senior pastors. I think my closest friend who is actually single, but and she's had to navigate her way through, and it took her a long time to be willing to even put her name forward for a call on account of this stuff. So I do think it can be difficult, for sure. I do think it can be difficult, but I do think we see it in Scripture. And not just those women. When we look at Romans 16 and we see all those women at the church that meets in their house, these women have planted churches that are in their homes again and again and again. And so there's a ripe amount of theological not even just indicators, they clearly exist and stuff. And I think that's also when people have an issue with it, then I think all we can do is say, well, how do you do Deborah then? What makes you think about Deborah, or how do you interpret Priscilla? And leave them with the question. Again, yeah.
A lot of people say about Deborah, oh, well, there was no suitable man available at the time to do the job. And when you bring Deborah forward, all these examples, that's the way that church leaders argue back at you. But that's wrong, yeah?
Honestly, I don't... I think we start extrapolating, because in Priscilla's case, she was there. In Junior's case, she was there. In Deborah's case, I think I would ask them where that verse was that said there were no available women to do the job, and say I often just say that's an interesting interpretation. I don't have to win the argument, and you don't have to win the argument. You have to be faithful to what you're called to do, and I think people have so reasoned these views. I mean, there are early church fathers who were anti-women who acknowledged those women as leaders, and who acknowledge their role and their contribution, even though the other things they say are horrendous about women. And so there's enough scholarship, and again, throughout Christian history, of denominations birthed by women, of movements led by women. In Celtic times with the monasteries, the abbot and the abbess, because they both reflected the Father heart of God. They both reflected Abba. So there's a clear body of scholarship and indicators and tradition, but that doesn't necessarily change anybody's mind.
Any hands up, questions? Yep.
Hi. I was wondering if you could give us any advice about when we're in certain sort of Christian support groups which aren't a part of our own church, so we don't actually have that much power. It's long been my experience that the kind of places I've been to, like Christian unions at school and at uni, and regional groups, they always have men as speakers and guest speakers, and never women, because they're kind of the view that, well, everyone believes men can speak, but not everyone believes women can. And how can we change that when they're so big and powerful?
Jo just said, I have an answer, I just don't know if it's the one I should say. We want to hear the one that she's not sure that she should say, don't we?
You're so naughty. What we did because I was a student leader in Sheffield, is we set something else up. And I mean, to be blunt, because I think there was the whole thing of it's a secondary issue. Now, I'm not one to pick up my ball and walk off in a huff. I don't mean that. I'm going to have a conversation because they're brothers. These people are my brothers. They're still family, but I don't agree with everything my brothers do. I certainly don't agree with their soccer team support or the football teams they're into, and things like that. And so I try not to make it a big issue. What we did in our church context was, if it got to a point where generations of men and women were being held back, spiritually because they weren't able to flourish. So in the end, we thought, well, the church is, we're called to be the arms and the feet of Jesus. We needed to get on and just set something else up. And I know that sounds quite contentious, but we weren't satisfied with the answer that this is an easier option. It was like, because it's a secondary issue, we'll just have no women leaders then. I thought, how did that land there? We said, well, we offered. It was a process. We offered many. We said, well, here's a whole list of women that you could have. This is where they come from. This is their track record. Often they're more comfortable with missionaries because they don't mind them speaking to people who aren't them. And so we just gave them a list of missionaries who went and planted churches around the world. And after every degree of thing, and we spent a lot of time talking. I was really good friends. I actually have a lot of complementarian friends, and said, okay, well, if we can't do it, we'll do things separately, but we'll do that well, and we'll be friendly. And I'm certainly not going to diss you because you're my family, but and I like to speak well of my family, but equally I have to be faithful to what God's called us to do.
Yeah, and I think as well, just keep feeding back stuff, So I've been in so many situations where churches have organised conferences and you get to like the planning meetings or the planning stage, and unless women speak up most of the time and say, actually, the list you've put together is all men, it somehow just doesn't get noticed. So I think it's like so in this situation, emailing and saying, I know you're thinking ahead to who you can ask to come speak here, whatever. Here's some ideas. You can listen to the podcasts or you can listen to them when they spoke at this festival or wherever. And also to point out that while some guys might say, they don't really want to hear from women or whatever, or they don't think women are good enough, if you did a straw poll, I bet most women would say they'd like to hear from some more women. And why is it that only half of the population get to vote on who gets to speak? So I think just challenging is really important. But, and I think what Joe said is there's, I think there's a way that you could do that. But also, I think keep the conversation going so that you don't shut it down and that these guys can make a journey. For some of them, it might take a while, but for some, they may instantly go, gosh, I've just not thought about that and we've been in error.
Also, just a little bit of history to put all this into context. In the 60s, evangelicals in the Anglican Church were a tiny minority. And Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, who was a great evangelical leader, said, anyone who's an evangelical in the Anglican Church needs to leave. Get out from among them. They're not Bible believing. And John Stott said, no, I think we're called to stay and we're called to build. And I'm so glad he said that and did that, because now the Anglican Church, while there's still lots wrong with it, where it's a different animal and God's done amazing things. In the late 60s, in the middle 60s, the renewal movement, charismatic movement started in the Anglican Church. What the leaders did, which was wonderful, was not concentrate on all those who had a different theological point of view. They focused on the Lord and on building churches that would move in the power and the gifts of the Spirit. We're in the same situation now. For us at Soul Survivor, a few years ago, we talked about this a lot. And then we thought, the battle's won, really. It's all happened. All our friends, they do this. Our friends Roger and Maggie Ellis and the people we hung out with, it all happens. It's just a few who are... So we dropped the ball. And we stopped doing seminars on the biblical basis and everything like that. And then 2 years ago, we suddenly woke up and realized what was going on. That actually we'd gone backwards. And everything had gone backwards. And we were meeting loads of gifted, anointed women who felt marginalized and who felt insecure because we'd stopped presenting the biblical case. And we realized we actually had to start doing that again, and to do that and commit ourselves to do this for years. We're going to do this for years until the battle's won. And it's not a battle against anyone. It's a battle against wrong ideas, not wrong people. It's wrong ideas. And over the last 2-3 years, it hasn't helped. I also have, I'm very close to my dear friends in the New Frontiers churches. I just spoke a few weeks ago at their pastors' conference, and I'm going to do lots of stuff with them. This is one area I disagree with my friends. I want them to stay my friends. I love them. But I totally disagree on this area with my understanding of what they say. But I want to stay in relationship. I want to stay serving them, loving them, because I think very few do not believe in women in leadership because they're misogynists. It's because they've got a wrong interpretation of what the Bible teaches. Some, it may be something worse, but actually, for many, it's like, and they don't see it. Culturally, it's not seen. So we have to develop positively the culture. We have to develop, once you start saying, when I started work, my boss for 7 years was a woman. She was brilliant. Best boss you could have had. And she was everything that the stereotype of those days told you she shouldn't have been. She was thoughtful. She made decisions rationally. She didn't have mood swings. She treated us all well and consistently. She knew how to have fun. She knew how to have relationships, and yet it was clear she was the boss. And she was the chief accountant at Harvey Nichols. And I was one of her employees, and she was the best boss I ever had. At the end of that, culturally, I was sold. It was like flipping heck. I've worked for bosses who are male, who are nothing like that. And so it's when people see it, they see the scripture, but they see, hey, this is normal. Why did we make a fuss? Before Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, no one could conceive of a woman Prime Minister. Within a few years, whatever you think about her policies, it was like, this is normal. And that's what we've got to be consistent. When Paul says to the Ephesians, put on the whole armor of God, the breastplate of righteousness, the sword of the Spirit, we're at war and all of that. Was he just talking to men? And was he, where do we get this from? And also, it means that the stereotype of what it means to be masculine as well as feminine is more to do with Christian culture than it is with the Bible. And, Jesus modeled what it is to be a human being, which was to be sometimes to know how to be tough, to know what you're called to, but also to be tender, to weep, and to set your face like flint, and all of that stuff. So we have to build over the long term. And I think there's 3 elements here, and that we want to try and do at Soul Survivor is, one, is clearly explain and keep explaining the biblical basis. Number 2, we have to equip and train up women in leadership who have got the gifts, but just need, like everyone needs some training and some equipping and some encouraging. You know what? I spent my life trying to do that to all sorts of people. Everyone needs that. But the third bit, which is the most important, that is our greatest challenge here, and I know it is it's useless. In fact, it's counterproductive to do the first 2. If we don't do the third one, which is make space for women to lead. Because if we just do the first 2, guess what? We're just going to have half the population of the church is just going to be more frustrated than they were before. We have to make space. We have to find ways of doing that. And we have to be almost ruthless about that. And then let's see. If this is a work for almost a generation, then let's see at the end of that. Let's stick with it. Stick to what we believe God's called us to, what God's told us to, and others will gradually see it and get it.
Great. Yeah, I think this question rides on the back of what you've just said about stereotyping. I agree with what you said about women in leadership, but I just wanted to raise the issue of women within the family, and in particular within marriage. There's a certain perception that remains within churches and with outside churches that the man is the head of the family. And also the scripture in Ephesians, yes, it talks about mutual submission, but it also very clearly says, wives, submit to your husband. And if, for example, you're in a situation where a husband and wife are completely at loggerheads, cannot agree, is it then the wife's job to submit out of reverence for her husband, or should you apply the principle of mutual submission when there is a distinction made within that passage?
In the Greek, there isn't a distinction made in that passage. The word submit isn't in verse 22, it's only in verse 21. And so in the Greek, it says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And the phrase for it is an ellipsis. It's a kind of literary device. So then it applies all the context to where it says, so it's not in the Greek, it's not a re-emphasis of the word submit. It doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to it, but in the way that Mike shared that whole big picture of the three different groups, wives and husbands, fathers and children, masters and slaves, where you see it in the Greek where it says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, it's like, the next line is, wives to your husbands. That's what it literally says. Wives to your husbands, fathers to your children, masters and slaves. Now, that doesn't take the situation away. The word submit is hypotasso, which means, it does mean a degree of surrender. The word for love your husband is agape. It's actually sacrificially love. It's not a date night or anything like that. It's not like be nice. So there is a call to mutual sacrifice, mutual surrender. And to be honest, those of us who are married or have been in relationships know that every relationship looks one way on the outside and another way on the inside. I submit to my friends when we decide where we're going for dinner. Do you know what I mean? I want to have a curry because I always want to have a curry. They want to do something else. And at some point, somebody's got to decide. And part of the way, I guess, Chris and I and our marriage works out is, in the end, we both, our relationship is submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And sometimes what we've done theologically is we've said, wives, you're meant to submit to the men. Women, you're meant to love the wives. And they forget the out of reverence for Christ bit. Our marriages and all our relationships function in the shadow of the cross, and taking the character of Jesus, which is we come to our relationship and our decisions from a place of, I'm prepared to die to myself for what you need. But we both approach the cross. We both approach it together. And somehow we've extrapolated this whole theological position to say, does it mean I have to say yes to everything? Or does it mean I have to say no to everything because of this? And we've taken out the Christ bit completely. And so, and now, sometimes in the way our marriages looked, people would think I was a complementarian because I've said, you know what, when we came to the cross, I just said, Chris, I haven't got a clue. This is your call. I'm going to go with what you think because I'm just not sure. And other times our marriage, people would look and say, you're egalitarians. And to be honest, we say we're neither. We say our view is we submit in the light of the cross. And that means we pick up our cross daily, deny ourselves, and follow him. And so we approach our relationship. And I'm not saying we do this perfectly by any stretch of the imagination. We're like, okay, let's go to the cross again. Let's pray and fast about this again. But we approach it knowing that neither of us will always get our way. That self-denial is part of it. Sacrifice is part of it for us both. That is how we approach our marriage. And And now there are others who would say the way we approach our marriage is he makes the decisions, and that's the conclusion they've come to. But when we look at that scripture, there are a number of ways you can approach it. And some of that is cultural. Some of that is, some people say, no, we're equal partners, and so we try and work it out in equal ways. But when we look at the verse and what it says, I think it's important for us to remember that the overarching thing that Paul is saying is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, and then you work out and unpack what that would mean. I hope that's useful. At least I'm not saying it's a definitive answer, but to give us something to work with as we and argue.
Next question.
I was just wondering if you had any experience or advice about co-leading with guys, and just having good relationships with them and not getting weird.
I do, yeah, because Mike and I have worked together for years. In fact, for quite a long time, we travelled all over the world together, and I loved it. They were, apart from, these last few years being married, having my kids, where I've done less, they were some of the best years of my life. And actually, it wasn't weird at all. Because I just don't think that friendship needs to be weird. Men and women, it's good, isn't it? And now with Andy Croft as well, he's just one of my dearest friends. Mike's one of my dearest friends, and it's been such a privilege. And I think one thing that was huge for me was a realization when I was still single. And I had spent probably a lot of my life expecting that I would marry somebody in ministry and that we would do ministry together. And when I met my husband, he is very different to that and just didn't want to be on a stage at all. He's quite introverted and that sort of thing. And the penny finally dropped that I already had my partners in ministry. I was looking for a partner in the other sense of the word. And yeah, I don't know. I think sometimes is it that our culture is so hypersexualized that we think that men and women can't minister and work together and have fun together without something awful happening. I don't know if it's that. I don't know if it is the legacy of When Harry Met Sally, which some of you are too young to even know about, but that whole thing about men and women can't be friends and can't be close friends without something going horribly wrong. But and I think one thing that has really helped is, not helped, so one thing that's been just so wonderful has been seeing where I need them and actually where they need me. Not because I'm a woman and they're men, but because we're different. And I used to love that, especially when we were traveling and we would go to the same places again and again. And we would often stay in the same place and we would have those conversations where we work with the same teams consistently. And every now and again I'd say to Mike, something's not right there. And he'd say, I've had this feeling, and one of my greatest, I don't know if I've ever said this to you, was helping you to recognise your own intuition. And I loved that. That was just some of the privilege of working together. So I don't have any formulaic answers. I don't have any theological answers. All I know is it works, and it's been amazing, and I love it. I absolutely love it, and I don't know what else to say about that.
And can I just add, part of this, it's not just the sexualization of our society, but it's also, Joe alluded to it, it's the fact that we've turned the nuclear family into this God. The biblical bit is extended family. And of course there is, husbands and wives, that is a unique relationship. That is, that's a one flesh relationship. That's a picture of Christ and his church. That takes us back to before the fall, all of that. But the context of all of it, of bringing up children, of relating, is the wider family. And in those days, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it was always extended families. The grandparents, the uncles, the aunts, the nieces, the nephews, and the servants, they all lived in these enclosed courtyards together. And everyone was involved in bringing up the kids. I'm always giving Ali advice on, and all my friends, it's my right to do so. Well, especially when I'm the godfather, it's like, that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to, and all of that stuff. And that, you see, that affects ministry as well. When we see that it's not these exclusive roles. And that actually, when Ali got married to Joel, it didn't affect mine and Ali's relationship one bit. Joel is also my good friend. When Andy got married to Beth and I are great friends, and some of the best bits are when, a couple of times Beth's come with me on trips abroad and left Andy at home. And it's like, it's been wonderful. Who much better than having him along, and all of that. And do you know what I'm trying to say is stereotypes. We've got to be more biblical. And we've got this Christian culture that actually, the Christian culture in some ways is less biblical than the culture of the world around us. In lots of ways it's more biblical, but in a few ways it's like, oh my word, some of this stuff, and I believe in marriage. We want to defend marriage. We want to root for marriage. It's the basic building block for bringing up healthy children and all of that stuff. I believe in that. But you know what? Let's not turn that one relationship or that one unit into a God, because apart from anything else, those of us that are single end up feeling second-class citizens as well in the church in a way that we don't anywhere else in society. And that's also criminal.
Any other questions? Here we go.
It's often thrown at me, why didn't Jesus have any women in his 12 disciples? And I really struggled to come up with a good answer to it and just wondered if you could give me any tools.
Good question. Yeah, okay. I'll start and then I'll hand over to the theological guru. But partly when Jesus came, there were lots of things that he needed to achieve. And one of the things is that he was making a very specific statement in choosing 12 male disciples. He actually was re-establishing, you had the 12 tribes of Judah, and it was saying this of Israel, sorry. I knew I shouldn't have started this. And there was something very deliberate that he was doing there in talking about the newness of the kingdom, that something had shifted when he got there. And so there was a very deliberate thing, but in doing that deliberate thing, it wasn't limited to just the 12. So he had women that traveled with him. He had, the situation with Mary and Martha, and there were the others, the women that went to the tomb. And so there was the deliberate act, but then within the people that worked with him, ministered him, and supported his ministry financially, there were women. And so it's the two together. So yeah, he didn't, but there was a specific reason for that.
And I think sometimes the questions people ask are not sensible questions. Do you know what I mean? In the sense of, was Paul therefore wrong in what he did because he had women on his team? Because he clearly had women on his team. And it's like, well, if I'd almost throw the question back and say, so what do you make of Paul having women on his team then? Was he not following in? What do you make of how the early church did it? Because they clearly had loads of women. And I think it's almost like, why are we making a big theological statement out of that? Because there were no, as far as we can tell, there were no people of colour. I'm not sure there is anybody white there. Do you see what I'm saying? There were no Greeks. There were no Brits. There were no, and it's like, how far are we going to take that? There were no Asians. So do we say, therefore, well, I'm sorry, you're the wrong colour for leadership because they weren't in the 12? Now, I think if someone said that, they'd be that is the most racist thing. How could you say that? It's completely out of order, and it is. And it's the same with the women thing too. So I think sometimes the way we answer the question, rather than to feel you've got to have a direct answer, is pull back and say, what exactly are we saying here? And answer the question with another question, saying, are you saying then that 12 denote what leadership can be? And if they say yes, say, well, what do you make of people of colour in that then? How does that work? Or people of a different class? Or people of and just keep on throwing it back, because it's not your responsibility to answer the question. If they have the question, they can go to God with the answer. Do you see what I'm saying?
I just had a question, really, going back to what Mike said. I think that events like today were getting probably better at encouraging women to step forward. My own feeling is that there's still a lot more to be done on the equipping side when women get there, because I found the church to be a very different place than the workplace, and probably quite a long way behind. And we need to do something, I think, to equip women against misunderstandings, discouragement, aggression, bullying, and all those sorts of things. And there isn't really a great support network out there. And I just wondered if that's something that you were thinking about doing, in addition to events like today. What happens when women actually get there into ministry?
And I think for us, equal is something that we're refusing to define exactly what we'll do when we get together, because we want to keep going, with the flow and see where the needs are. And so, yeah, that could well be. And definitely one thing that we've been looking at, I think, for the next year is raising up young leaders and inputting into them in practical ways, regardless of gender. So there's some of those things that maybe won't come under the banner of equal, but hopefully will encourage and equip women as well as guys in their leadership. But yeah, that's definitely something we can consider for future equal stuff.
And just a really quick one, and then you carry on answering the question. On that, we really want to equip people, because once you start moving in leadership, that's the best answer, as well as going through the scriptures. The other best answer is just to do it. And it's just to do it, even in the tough situations, just to do it. And then actually it's like, what was my problem? This is as natural as anything. And I just want to give a plug quickly. Ali's written a couple of great books that are about to come out this summer. One with Liza, what's the name of the first one? Which is Heart to Heart, which again, I've read it, a great addition to the library. And the second one is on preaching, teaching, communicating. And Ali is actually the best trainer of speakers I've ever come across. In our church, it's been phenomenal. And what she's learnt and what she's put together is in the book. What's the name of that book? Loud and Clear. And that's coming out for the summer. They are excellent books, really excellent. And also in the autumn, Ali's going to do a series on helping people to communicate, to teach, to preach. If anyone wants to come on that, it will be so worth it. You get to do practical as well as, and we want to do this over and over again. And that, I mean, that's for anyone. All of it is for, but actually we want to find practical ways where we can raise people up. But you carry on answering the question.
I was just going to say as well, when you've got resources like that there, download them, buy them, get together with other women who you're journeying with and say, let's read this stuff, let's thrash it through ourselves, let's be ready to talk this through with other guys or other women that we meet who might be aggressive or, who have a different opinion or view. So that you feel prepared and equipped to talk about it, but then also to pray with one another and support one another and be one another's champions. And it's amazing how that your confidence will grow then, even if it's just with a few. So I've got several women that I will meet and talk with, and we'll thrash through these things over a glass of wine or wherever. But I think that's really important, and it's important for there to be bigger national networks, but at the end of the day, you need sometimes just a few companions who you're doing it with.